The study I read was the influence of reinforcement schedule on experience-dependent changes in motivation. Introduction and research question. This experiment tested how experience under fixed versus variable ratio reinforcement schedules altered future measures of performance under progressive ratio schedules. In a fixed ratio schedule, every n response is given reinforcement, and in this case, the FR was 5. In a variable ratio schedule, every nth response on average is given reinforcement, and in this case, the variable ratio was also 5. For a progressive ratio, the requirement to get reinforcement changes in between each response. In this experiment, for example, at first the mice needed 1 response, then 3, then 5, then 8, and so on. And in this case, the increase started to grow more and more each time. The methods used. The subjects used were 48-week-old male and female mice who were put in cages of 5 and were kept at 95% of free feeding weight. While being tested, the mice were placed in standard use operant conditioning chambers. These operant chambers had nose pokes, lights to signal a nose poke, and a syringe that dispersed the sucrose solution. In the experiment, the mice were required to perform nose pokes for the reinforcer of a sucrose solution. All mice went through a training phase of an FR schedule of 1 with a max of 50 reinforcements per day. 4 of the 40 mice did not make it past this phase. The next phase was the progressive ratio phase. As stated before, the number of required behavior, in this case nose presses, increased after each reinforcement. This phase would end after an hour or when the mice did not perform the behavior for 10 minutes straight. The next phase was the fixed ratio versus variable ratio session with both ratios being 5. This phase was 5 days of 1-hour sessions. Then the mice would undergo the second progressive ratio phase, which was identical to the first progressive ratio phase, except it would last 6 hours. Finally, the extinction phase lasted 4 days. Moving on to the results. The results of the training phase are shown within graphs A and B. As you can see, the fixed ratio group and the variable ratio group of mice had about the average rate of responses per minute and underwent about the same amount of days to acquire the task. However, as stated before, 4 of the mice did not make it past this phase. Graphs C and D show the results of the first progressive ratio phase. As you can see, both groups performed almost identical in this phase. During the FR5 and VR5 training, there were no differences in responding between the groups as seen in the cumulative records from day 5 of the sessions, which is shown within the graphs A and B on the left side of the slide. Next, graph A on the right side of the slide shows that the maximum progressive ratios reached for both groups in both progressive ratio training phases. What is interesting about graph B on the right side of the slide is that training under any schedule significantly increased maximum progressive ratio performance between progressive ratio phase 1 and phase 2. Moving on to the discussion. This experiment was looking to see if the experience under fixed versus variable ratio reinforcement schedules altered future measures of performance under progressive ratio schedules. The maximum ratio reached in post-training compared to pre-training progressive ratio increased. Also, extinction occurred at the same rate for both the fixed ratio group and the variable ratio group, as seen in the figure at the bottom of the page. Critical questions. How would the results differ if the mice were not given a training acquisition session at the start of the procedure? And could an increase of the ratio between both the fixed and variable ratio schedule change the results of the post-training progressive ratio?